You got all those books, the Bible, the different Gospels and stuff that people are quite familiar with. Half the time, they didn't even need to read the subtitles. They could look at it and know what was going on.
Mel Gibson is revisiting the story of Jesus, but not the one most people know. His focus points toward ancient Ethiopian texts that describe events after the resurrection, raising a deeper issue about why these writings were preserved in one place, yet remained largely unseen everywhere else. The revelation that sparked global attention. The discussion began when Mel Gibson moved forward with a new project focused on the resurrection of Jesus Christ, drawing attention in 2024 across film and religious circles in Hollywood. Unlike earlier portrayals, the focus shifted beyond the crucifixion and into what followed after. This matters because most traditional narratives stop at the resurrection, leaving the period after largely unexplored in mainstream discussions. As details about the project circulated, interest expanded beyond cinema. Researchers and audiences began revisiting ancient sources that exist outside the standard Western canon. This included texts preserved in regions like Ethiopia, where alternative biblical traditions have been maintained for centuries. The conversation moved quickly from film production to historical inquiry, linking modern storytelling with ancient material. Online platforms and academic spaces began referencing these lesser-known writings, especially those describing post-resurrection events and teachings. This shift created a broader discussion about what sources were included in mainstream Christianity and what remained outside it. That distinction is important. It highlights how visibility, rather than existence, often determines what becomes widely accepted. What began as a film announcement evolved into a deeper investigation. The project did not introduce new texts, but it redirected attention toward material that had remained preserved, yet largely overlooked. The Bible that isn't like the others. The Ethiopian Bible presents a structure that differs significantly from Western versions, containing 81 books compared to the 66 books of the Protestant Bible and the 73 books used in Catholic tradition. This difference is not recent. The expanded canon has been preserved in Ethiopia for over 1,600 years, maintaining texts that were part of early Christian and Jewish traditions. Among these are works such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah, each offering additional narratives and perspectives not included in most modern Bibles. These writings were not later additions. They existed during the formative periods of Christianity, but were not included in canon decisions shaped in regions like 4th century Rome. This matters because it challenges the idea that Christianity developed from a single, unified set of texts. Instead, it suggests multiple streams of tradition existed simultaneously, with different communities preserving different collections. The Ethiopian Church maintained its canon independently, without removing texts that were excluded elsewhere. The result is a broader version of Scripture that reflects continuity rather than selection. It shows that what is commonly accepted today represents one version of a larger historical landscape, shaped by decisions made over time rather than a single fixed origin. This continuity also explains why certain themes appear more developed within Ethiopian texts. Ideas about angels, cosmic order, and divine hierarchy are often expanded in ways that connect early Jewish writings with later Christian teachings. These links suggest that theological concepts evolved across multiple texts, not within a single closed system. By preserving this wider collection, Ethiopia retains a version of Christianity that reflects both its origins and its early diversity. A faith preserved in isolation. Christianity took root in Ethiopia during the early 4th century, developing alongside but separate from the growing influence of Rome. This matters because its foundation was formed before centralized control shaped doctrine across much of Europe. Geographic distance played a key role. Surrounded by natural barriers and operating outside Roman authority, Ethiopia maintained its religious structure without external intervention. That separation created conditions where texts could remain unchanged while other regions moved towards standardization. Monastic communities became the center of this preservation. In places like Aksum, monks carefully maintained scriptures written in Ge'ez, copying them by hand over more than 1,500 years. Each generation followed the same process, ensuring that wording, structure, and sequence were passed forward without alteration. This method was not driven by expansion or revision, but by continuity. At the same time, Christianity in other regions underwent translation, selection, and formal canon decisions. Councils influenced which texts would be included and how they would be interpreted. Ethiopia followed a different path. Instead of editing its tradition, it maintained the full body of texts it had received. The result is a version of Christianity shaped by preservation rather than revision. It reflects a continuous line of transmission, where manuscripts remained stable even as other traditions evolved. This continuity also influenced how teachings were understood and practiced. Without constant revision, theological ideas remained closely tied to their original context, preserving early interpretations alongside the texts themselves. Monastic traditions reinforced this stability by limiting external influence and maintaining strict copying practices. Over time, this created a system where both scripture and interpretation moved together, unchanged. In contrast, regions influenced by translation and debate often saw shifts in meaning as language and structure evolved. Ethiopia's approach ensured that its version of Christianity remained consistent, not only in text, but in understanding, preserving a form of belief that reflects its earliest foundations. The Book of Enoch changes everything. Among the texts preserved in the Ethiopian Canon, the Book of Enoch stands out for its detailed descriptions of events that expand beyond standard biblical narratives. This text, known in early traditions but later excluded in many regions, introduces the story of the Watchers, fallen angels who descended to earth and shared forbidden knowledge with humans. These teachings included skills, technologies, and practices that altered early human society. The text also describes the Nephilim, large hybrid beings said to exist before the flood. Their presence introduces a layer of history not fully explained in the Old Testament, but briefly referenced. This matters because it connects fragmented mentions in traditional scripture with a more detailed narrative preserved elsewhere. Another key element is the title Son of Man, presented in Enoch as a pre-existing divine figure before the time of Jesus Christ. This title later appears frequently in the Gospels, where Jesus uses it to describe himself. The continuity between these texts suggests that certain ideas present in early Jewish writings carried forward into later Christian teachings. The preservation of this text in Ethiopia provides a version of the narrative that remained intact while being removed or minimized in other traditions. It shows that concepts central to Christianity may have deeper roots, extending into earlier writings that were not universally retained. The resurrection story that goes further. The Ethiopian texts present a version of the resurrection that extends beyond the familiar narrative found in the Western Bible, describing not only the return of Jesus Christ, but a journey through multiple spiritual layers preserved in traditions dating back to the 1st century. This matters because it reframes the resurrection as a process rather than a single moment. Instead of focusing only on the empty tomb, these writings describe movement through unseen realms before the final return. One of the key sources, the Ascension of Isaiah, outlines a structured descent and ascent through different levels of heaven. According to this account, Jesus moves through these realms, interacting with spiritual forces and passing through layers of existence that are not visible in physical reality. That distinction is important. It shifts the event from something purely historical into something cosmic in scale. The narrative describes a progression where the resurrection is part of a larger sequence involving transformation, passage, and return. This expands the meaning of resurrection beyond physical revival. It becomes a transition through different states of existence, each with its own role and significance. In traditions preserved in Ethiopia, this perspective remained intact, offering a broader interpretation of events that were later simplified in other regions. The difference is not in contradiction, but in depth. The Ethiopian texts add layers to the story, showing a version of the resurrection that operates across both physical and spiritual dimensions. The canon was never fixed. Early Christianity did not begin with a single unified Bible. During the 1st century, communities across regions such as Rome, Alexandria, and Ethiopia used different collections of texts, each reflecting local traditions and teachings. This matters because it shows that what is now considered standard developed over time, not from the beginning. The idea of a fixed canon came later, shaped by discussion and decision rather than immediate agreement. Over the next several centuries, debates about doctrine and interpretation led to formal gatherings where leaders determined which texts would be included. Events such as the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD played a role in establishing consistency, but they did not create the canon instantly. The process extended across generations, influenced by theological priorities, regional acceptance, and the need for unified teaching. This created a structure where some texts were included while others were left outside. The reasons were not always based on authenticity alone. In many cases, alignment with emerging doctrine and clarity of teaching played a significant role. That distinction is important. It shows that exclusion did not always mean falsehood, but sometimes reflected differences in emphasis or interpretation. In regions like Ethiopia, where these decisions were not enforced in the same way, a broader collection of texts continued to exist. This preserved an alternative view of early Christianity, one that reflects diversity rather than uniformity. Why certain books were left out. Early Christian texts did not disappear randomly. Their inclusion or exclusion followed patterns shaped during key moments such as the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where leaders in Rome began defining what would represent official doctrine. This matters because the process was not only about preserving truth, but also about creating a stable and unified system. As Christianity expanded across regions, consistency became necessary, and that required selecting texts that aligned with a shared structure. Some writings presented ideas that operated outside institutional control. Texts emphasizing direct connection with the divine reduced the need for centralized authority. That distinction is important. It created tension between personal spirituality and organized systems. Writings that encouraged individual interpretation or internal revelation introduced variability, making them harder to standardize across large communities. At the same time, mystical and visionary texts added another layer of complexity. Narratives involving cosmic journeys, symbolic visions, or layered meanings required interpretation that could differ from one group to another. This created challenges for leaders trying to establish clear and consistent teaching. Preference was often given to texts that presented structured narratives, clear doctrine, and practical guidance for growing communities. Language and geography also influenced survival. Texts preserved in regions outside Roman influence, such as Ethiopia, remained intact, while others circulating within Europe were filtered through translation and selection processes. This difference shaped which writings became widely known and which remained localized. The result is a canon that reflects both belief and structure. Some texts were not excluded because they lacked value, but because they did not align with the emerging framework of organized Christianity. The manuscripts that survived against all odds. Ethiopia holds one of the largest collections of ancient Christian manuscripts, with estimates reaching into the hundreds of thousands, preserved across regions such as Aksum and remote monastic sites. Some of these texts date back to between the 4th century and the 6th century, making them among the oldest surviving Christian writings. This matters because their survival was not the result of centralized preservation, but of continuous effort carried out in isolation. Monasteries such as Debre Damo played a central role in this process. Located in difficult terrain and accessible only by rope, these sites remained largely untouched by external forces. Monks in these locations copied texts by hand, maintaining accuracy across generations. This method ensured that manuscripts were not only preserved, but also transmitted without interruption. Historical events that affected other regions, such as invasions, conflicts, and political changes, had limited impact on these isolated centers. While many texts in Europe were lost, altered, or destroyed over time, Ethiopian manuscripts remained protected by geography and tradition. That distinction is important. It shows how isolation can preserve material that might otherwise disappear. Even today, many of these manuscripts remain unstudied. Stored in monasteries and libraries, they exist outside modern academic systems, waiting to be examined and translated. This creates a situation where significant portions of early Christian writing are still not fully understood or widely accessible. The survival of these texts reflects a continuous chain of preservation, where knowledge was maintained not through institutions, but through dedication and isolation. The story. Hollywood might reveal. The upcoming sequel, directed by Mel Gibson, expected to move forward after discussions in 2024, shifts attention from the crucifixion to events following the resurrection of Jesus Christ, with production tied closely to Hollywood studios. This matters because most visual portrayals have focused on suffering and death, while leaving the post-resurrection narrative largely untouched. The new direction introduces themes that extend beyond physical events into spiritual movement and transformation. The concept being explored includes descent into unseen realms, interaction with spiritual dimensions, and a return that carries meaning beyond the material world. These ideas are not newly created for cinema. They align closely with early writings such as The Ascension of Isaiah, where structured movement through different layers of existence is described in detail. That distinction is important. It connects modern storytelling with ancient material that has existed outside mainstream awareness. As these themes enter public discussion, they begin to bridge a gap between preserved texts and popular understanding. Concepts once limited to regions like Ethiopia or early Christian traditions may now reach a broader audience through visual interpretation. This creates a shift in how the story is perceived, moving from a single event into a layered process involving both physical and spiritual dimensions. The impact of such a portrayal extends beyond film. When widely viewed, it introduces alternative interpretations that challenge simplified narratives. It does not replace existing beliefs, but it expands the framework through which they are understood. The question that changes everything. The texts preserved in Ethiopia, maintained continuously for over 1,600 years, were never lost or rediscovered. They remained intact while other regions moved in a different direction. This matters because it reframes the discussion. The issue is not about missing information, but about which traditions became widely accepted and which remained localized. The difference lies in visibility, not existence. As Christianity developed across regions such as Rome during the 4th century, decisions about doctrine and canon shaped what would be recognized as official teaching. These decisions created a structured framework that allowed for consistency across expanding populations. That distinction is important. It shows that selection was part of building a unified system, not necessarily a complete one. The Ethiopian tradition followed a different path. Without the same external pressures, it preserved a broader collection of texts, maintaining continuity rather than reducing it. This creates two parallel perspectives, one shaped by institutional development, the other by long-term preservation. The contrast between these approaches introduces a deeper question about how religious understanding is formed. If multiple versions of early Christian writings existed at the same time, then what is commonly accepted today represents one path among several. This does not resolve the differences, but it changes how they are viewed. It suggests that early Christianity may have been more diverse in structure and interpretation than later systems reflect, leaving open the question of how much of that diversity remains outside mainstream awareness. Mel Gibson's renewed focus on the life of Jesus Christ has done more than revisit a familiar story. It has redirected attention toward texts preserved for over 1,600 years in Ethiopia. These writings were never lost or hidden in the traditional sense. They existed in parallel, maintained outside the structures that shaped mainstream Christianity in places like Rome during the 4th century. What changes now is visibility. Ideas once limited to specific regions are entering broader discussion, not as new discoveries, but as preserved material being seen differently. This shift brings forward a larger context, where the story of Jesus extends beyond a single narrative into multiple traditions that developed side by side. The contrast is no longer between truth and absence, but between what was widely accepted and what remained local. And in that contrast, the boundaries of the story begin to expand.